Okay, so this morning we're privileged to have a great speaker, Dr. Mark Wright, who, as the slide says, he's the assistant professor of ancient scriptures at Brigham Young University. And I will tell you, last night I read his bio a couple of times, and I'm a Marine, and I had to have my wife help me read the bio because it had some words in there that I couldn't pronounce. So I looked them up, and actually I did a little bit of study, and I found out a little bit about the Greek origin of the words and what they meant. But I'm going to let you do that yourself when you get an opportunity. You need to read his bio. He's from Long Beach, California. He served a mission in Colombia, and I wasn't quite sure how to pronounce the name of the place in Colombia, so I'm going to not say that. And he was there 1991 to 93. When he came back, he finished his bachelor's degree at UCLA, and then he got a master's and a PhD from UC Riverside. And and his emphasis has been on Mesoamerican archaeology. And I watch a lot of reality TV, and I watch American Pickers. And so they're antique archaeology, and he's Mesoamerican archaeology, and I figure they're pretty similar. So, you know, I think we're really lucky to have him here today with us. And he's very distinguished. He's published a lot. He's been a presenter and a speaker at very distinguished universities like Oxford, Harvard, Yale, Duke, UCLA, and many others. So we're really privileged to have him here today. He is now an assistant professor at BYU in American Studies and Ancient Scriptures, and we're happy to have him here. His wife is also involved in history, and she's an adjunct professor at Utah Valley University. And when I went to BYU a long time ago, I think that was Utah Tech, and then it became Utah Valley State University now, or Utah Valley State College, and now it's a university. So it's continued to progress. They have one child that was born in April of this year, and so we're really privileged to have Mark here with us today, Dr. Wright, and so I'd like to turn the time over to you. Thank you.
Well, it's a privilege for me to be here today with all of you. Any chaplains from Knob Noster, Missouri, by any chance? My little brother is, he's in the Air Force there, and he was actually just named Airman of the Year, and I wanted to verify that he really was and wasn't just telling us that. I have to excuse me, I've been fighting a cold the last week or so. So I've titled my presentation, Finding Mesoamerica in the Book of Mormon, rather than Finding the Book of Mormon in Mesoamerica. Back in the old days, when we did Book of Mormon archaeology, we would basically go down with a shovel and try to dig up Zarahemla. And it turned out it didn't work. There's a lot of cities down there. By some estimates, less than 1% of all cities have been excavated. Thanks to satellite imagery, we know of about 6,000 just in the Maya area sites that are laying under the jungle, unexcavated. And each of these sites has dozens, hundreds, and even thousands of buildings. So it's fair to say that there's a whole lot that we still don't know. There was kind of a paradigm shift away from going down with a shovel to trying to find elements of Mesoamerica, probably in the 50s and 60s, but the main proponent of that was John Sorensen. We owe him a great debt of gratitude, I think, in moving forward our understanding of the Book of Mormon by looking for Mesoamerican cultural elements in the Book of Mormon. We'll talk a little bit about why that would be the case in a little bit. I'll mention that John Sorensen has a brand new book called Mormon's Codex. It's about 800 pages, and I've been working my way through it for a few weeks now, and I'm only about page 150. So, but if any of you happen to have a whole lot of time and about $60 extra, I would recommend picking up a copy. Now, when we talk about Mesoamerica, it doesn't refer to any strict geographical boundaries, but generally extends from northern or central Mexico. Mexico City would be right around here, down through the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. This is Guatemala, Yucatan, Belize, and then a little bit into Honduras as well. chronologically, it spans thousands of years. It begins with the Olmec culture. They're known as kind of the mother culture of Mesoamerica. They began arising around 1500 BC, give or take. And from there, culture kind of radiates outward towards the Maya area and to central Mexico. But their influence is felt far and wide throughout the millennia, really. What unites these cultures isn't necessarily language. We know that there were scores of different languages that were spoken anciently. Even today in the Maya area, there are 31 Mayan languages that are still spoken. Despite what the History Channel says, the Maya didn't mysteriously disappear. Their civilization collapsed, but the people are still alive and well. Basically just means they stopped building their big buildings. The rulers were all deposed, and the meek inherited the earth, so to speak. So it's kind of this cultural complex, but there's a lot of diversity within that. Similar to the church. We've got members of the church in Polynesia have some of their unique traditions that they maintain. Here in Utah, we've got our Jell-O with the carrot strips in it, right? So we've all got our unique cultural traditions, but it's the gospel that sort of unites us. Now, why do we look in Mesoamerica? John Sorensen wasn't the first to look there, and if we actually look back at the Times and Seasons, Joseph Smith, when he was editor, and it's likely that he was author of this as well. There's some debate about this, but we've done stylometric analyses, word print analysis, and these editorials seem to have been written by Joseph Smith. Essentially, prior to 1842, when Joseph got a copy of a book called Incidents of Travel in Central America and Yucatan, there wasn't really anything known about Mesoamerica. The typical public perception of any natives in the New World were the savages living in teepees, in their canoes, wearing their moccasins, and the idea that these quote-unquote savages could have true culture was almost laughable. But then John Lloyd Stevens, a very popular travel writer at the time, took an artist named Frederick Catherwood down to Central America, and they did some exploring. And he wrote this fantastic tale of all of the wonderful things they discovered. And Catherwood drew these meticulous drawings, and it was the first time anybody had ever gotten a glimpse of these magnificent buildings. The book was published in 1841, and it took the public imagination by storm. I mean, it was kind of like the Harry Potter of its day. People were lining up to buy it, went through 15 printings of its first edition. And John Bernheisel, who was a convert to the church and a bishop in New York City, got a copy of it. And he was flipping through it, and he's like, oh, man, I've got to send this to Joseph. He's going to go crazy for this. And I think it was Wilford Woodruff was, I think it was Willard Richards, was returning from a mission, was passing through New York. Bernheisel gave him a copy of this to bring to Joseph, and sure enough, Joseph flipped. He thought this was amazing. And then he wrote this. Mr. Stevens's great developments of antiquities are made bare to the eyes of all people by reading the history of the Nephites in the Book of Mormon. They lived about the narrow neck of land, which now embraces Central America, with all the cities that can be found. And then in the next issue, 2 weeks later, we have found another important fact relating to the truth of the Book of Mormon. Central America, or Guatemala, is situated north of the Isthmus of Darien and once embraced several hundred miles of territory from north to south. The city of Zarahemla, burnt at the crucifixion of the Savior and rebuilt afterwards, stood upon this land. Now, previous to this, in the 1830s, he had made some general statements about Nephites and Lamanites in North America. But the first time he puts a specific city from the Book of Mormon in a real-world geography is after he sees these books. And so for me, this carries a lot of weight. Joseph Fielding Smith, in Doctrines of Salvation, I think it's volume 3, says, he reaffirms that they lived about the narrow neck, and the majority of their kingdom took place there, both Jaredites and Nephites and Lamanites. Now, one important, I guess, paradigm shift that we need to keep in mind, I suppose. As many of you are probably aware, they recently changed the introduction to the Book of Mormon, the new 2013 edition of the Book of Mormon. In the previous edition, it said that the Lamanites are the principal ancestors of the Native Americans. They've changed that. It no longer says they are the principal ancestors. It says they are among the ancestors. And that is a huge difference. In other words, when it says they are the principal ancestors, that means that most Native Americans would be descended from the Lamanites. But by saying they are among the ancestors, that means that there were already people here. And archaeologically, we know that that's the case. But what I want to suggest is this isn't a new concept. In fact, back in 1929, Elder Ivins President Ivins of the First Presidency cautioned, "We must be careful in the conclusions that we reach. The Book of Mormon teaches the history of 3 distinct peoples who came from the Old World to this continent. It does not tell us that there was no one here before them, and it does not tell us that people did not come after. And so if discoveries are made which suggest differences in race origins, it can very easily be accounted for, and reasonably, for we do believe that other people came to this continent. 1,000 years had elapsed from the time of the Book of Mormon closed until the discovery of America, and we know that other people came to America during that period. And archaeologically, we know that people came before that. At some point in church history, and it was really kind of it seems to have been in the early to mid 20th century, the perception that the promised land equaled an empty land kind of crept into the church. When the children of Israel reached their promised land, was it empty? They had to chase people out of there, didn't they? And so when Lehi comes to his promised land, it doesn't necessarily mean that it was an empty continent. And so that's important for this kind of whole paradigm, I guess, of understanding finding Mesoamerica in the Book of Mormon. If we take a small group like Lehi's party, Lehi and his family, Ishmael and his family, we've got 20, 25 people, and you drop them in the midst of a pre-existing population, acculturation happens. The large group influences the small group rather than the small group influencing broadly the large group. And so what we do is we look for essentially Mesoamerican influence in the Book of Mormon because that's what's going to happen. That's just the way cultures work. Just as we as members of the church, we are largely products of our culture in the sense that the clothing we wear is typical American clothing. The dishes that we wear, that we don't have Mormon dishes, right? We just have normal dishes like everybody else. So our material culture is going to look a lot like whatever culture that we're a part of. Hopefully that makes sense. Now, chronologically, there's actually a very nice matchup between the cities of the Book of Mormon and those of Mesoamerica. We know, of course, the Jaredites came sometime around 1500 BC, give or take. We don't know the exact dates, perhaps as early as 2200, 2500 BC. There are no dates in the bottom of the Bible like they are in the Book of Mormon, so we're left to guess. And of course, the Jaredites flourished till sometime around 500, 600 BC. We know there's some overlap between the Jaredites and the Mulekites. Coriantum, or the last surviving Jaredite, wandered into the land of the Mulekites. And the city of Nephi, we know, is a highland city, meaning it's up in elevation because it's always up to Nephi. And Zarahemla is a lowland city because it's always down to Zarahemla. It almost seems counterintuitive. When we think up, we sometimes think north, but up was always south to Nephi, and down was always north to Zarahemla. So they're talking elevation up and down. Excuse me. Now, we can parallel this with the what's known in Mesoamerica. The Olmec cities begin to flourish around 1500 BC. We see, as their civilization declines, we see a rise in highland Maya cities like Camino-Huyu, where Guatemala City is built right on top of it, essentially. And then a few centuries later, we get kind of a depopulation, a shift in population centers from the highlands to the lowlands, occurring right around the time that Mosiah flees the land of Nephi and goes down to Zarahemla. So he's leaving this highland population down to a lowland population. So it's a very nice matchup of sort of geographical descriptions and chronology. Sorry. So the question is, what is archaeology? A lot of times I tell people I'm an archaeologist, and they say, oh, my nephew loves dinosaurs. And I'm like, sorry, that's a different study. That's paleontology. Archaeologists don't study dinosaurs, we study people. We are actually anthropologists. Archaeology is a subfield of anthropology. Anthropology is the study of humans. Archaeology is the study of dead humans. And how do we study them? Well, it's kind of like the American pickers. We're basically glorified trash diggers. You can learn a lot about somebody by digging through their trash. And so it's literally the scientific study of past human cultures by analyzing the material remains, meaning the sites and the artifacts that people left behind. Because that's all we're left with. And so we dig these things up, and then we try to interpret what it is that's been found. Now, in studying the Book of Mormon, we might ask what material remains might have been left by people in the Book of Mormon. What types of objects do they describe that we could reasonably expect to find in the archaeological record? They talk about metal records. They talk about ancient writing. Of course, the book was found in a stone box. They talk a lot about war. We're in the war chapters with my Book of Mormon classes at BYU right now. Talk of cities, roads, temples, towers, palaces, cement houses, royal monuments, complex calendars. These are all things that we would expect to find archaeologically. So what I want to do is show you the evidence that we have for these different types of material remains. In Helaman 3:15, it says they had books and records of every kind. So it's not just books, it's records of every kind. And that's always kind of stuck out to me. Well, what other kind of records are there? And if we look, it turns out there are a lot of different types. This is what a pre-Columbian book looked like. Now, one important fact I need to point out, in locating the Book of Mormon in Mesoamerica, there's a lot of debate whether Mesoamerica is the right place or not. The church takes no official position on it. But Mesoamerica is the only place in the entire New World where there are books and writing. It's the only literate culture in the entire New World in pre-Columbian times. There are 14 different scripts that are known from pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, only 2 or 3 of which we can translate at all, one of which we have fairly well deciphered, which is the Mayan language. Thank you. But this is what their books looked like. They were screenfold books, kind of folded out like an accordion. They would stack about this tall. They're only about this big, but when you unfold it, it would reach from here to the piano. And so these things would stretch for 7, 10 meters at times. And they would write on them hieroglyphs. They would include drawings and captions. Unfortunately, only 4 of them survived the conquest. The Spaniards gathered all these books together, set fire to them, much to the consternation of the natives. But to be fair, the natives did this to each other. The Aztecs were notorious for any time they conquered their enemies, they would burn their books. The winners literally write the history. Now I have, almost as a joke here, Alma 12:1. It says Alma did unfold the scriptures unto them. I'm like, hey, that's how you read these things, you unfold them. So that one's more speculative. I think the rest of what I have is a little more solid, but I think that's kind of funny. So what are these records of every kind? Well, in the Old World, we have lots of evidence of writing on metal plates. These Roman plates were on display at BYU for a while, the famous plates of Darius, written on gold in a stone box. I mean, that's a nice little fit. These are some Etruscan plates with writing on them. From the New World, we don't have as much gold or metal plates that have survived. One of the reasons why is because the Spaniards, at the time of the conquest, demanded all of the gold. They actually put a sword to Montezuma's neck and said, bring us all the gold in the kingdom, and he had to fill up a room from floor to ceiling. They melted it down into gold bars called ingots, and they shipped them back to Spain. So very little gold survives. But what does survive makes it very clear they knew how to finely work these things. Very, very thin, as thin as aluminum foil. This one you can't really make out, but there are hieroglyphs around the edges of it. And so we don't have any lengthy book-length treatments on gold, but perhaps the day will come when we'll find some that the Spanish didn't get their hands on. Now in the New World, typically we find, these are the other records of every kind, I think. They love to write on jade. Jade was their most precious stone. There's ceramic pots they were very fond of. And this is actually a human femur that they wrote on. It's kind of hard to make out. Let me point out some things here. So this is basically very formulaic. It starts with a date. They always start with a count of 400 years and a count of 20 years and a count of years and a count of 20 days and a count of days. And so the first several glyphs here are just a count of days. And then it just says, Chumlach Tiahalel, he acceded into rulership. So this is just to commemorate the ruler's accession. This bone, on the side here, it actually is it's a drawing. It's not hieroglyphs, but this, you see this line going across here, that's actually the rim of a canoe. And this is the maize god, the god of corn. And he's got his right arm on the edge of the canoe. You can see his fingers there, his elbow. And he's got his other hand to his forehead, like this. He's mourning because he's dead. And he's being conveyed to the underworld in this canoe by a monkey god. You see the monkey's tail here, his arm on the canoe. And then this weird bird god. You see his eye, his beak, and he's also in the same pose of mourning. And then along the top, we actually have some glyphs. And I think it says, Ubak Hasao Chankawil. This is the bone of Hasao Chankawil, which is a ruler of Tikal. And these pots always have glyphs going around the top of them. Now, typically, they're very formulaic. In fact, many of them have the exact same text with only one glyph that's a little bit different. And before we knew how to translate these glyphs, we started to crack the code in the 70s. and we can translate about 85 to 90% of them now. We thought perhaps this was some sort of magical incantation. Turns out, and you're going to think I'm kidding, but this is real. It says, "This is his cup for drinking hot chocolate." And the one glyph that's always different is the person's name who owns the cup. They invented hot chocolate, and that is literally Yukib Kakawa. It is his cup for hot chocolate. A lot of the images I'm going to be showing you through the rest of the presentation are coming from pots like this, and we've got this technology where we can rotate the vessel while leaving the aperture open on the camera, and it creates this flat scene out of this round vessel. And so I'll highlight those as we come to them. So anyways, this is what I think they're talking about when they have records of every kind. Stone boxes, of course. Moroni buried the plates in a stone box in the hill in New York. We have, if you ever go to the Anthropology Museum in Mexico City, there are dozens of these things. And they would bury these things, and they would put their most sacred objects inside of them, their most treasured objects, like jade, for example. And they would give these as cash offerings or sacred offerings. And so I think Moroni, coming from a Mesoamerican mindset, it made sense for him to put the plates in a stone box. So when it comes to war, a lot of talk of this again. Talk about swords and scimitars, shields, bucklers, body armor, arrows and darts, human sacrifice, fortifications, etc. What we're looking at here, this is from the site of Yaxchilan. Very quick story, actually. I was there a few years ago. I've been there many times. The guards have kind of come to know me. And you have to get there by boat. And I get up to the site, and they're like, "Hey, you want to see something cool?" And I was like, "Well, yeah, of course I do." And so they walked me up what looks just like a hill, but it's actually an unexcavated temple. And there's a big piece of corrugated plastic. He's like, "Help me move this." So we pull it off, and this monument's just sitting in the dirt. And it's been there for 1,500 years. I'm like, "Why is this here?" And he's like, nobody's ever bothered to, clean it up and take it to a museum. And I tried to get a picture of it, but there was a giant spider, like that big, and spiders are my weakness. It's like Indiana Jones and snakes. That's like me with spiders. So all of the pictures I have are blurry because my hand was shaking so bad. But the drawing's better anyway. But what we're looking at, this is, his name is Bird Jaguar. That's his nickname. Yashun Balam is his Mayan name. He's the ruler of Yaxchilan, and he's capturing this poor war captive. And it says right here, Ubak Yashun Balam Kuhul Pachanahau. He is the captive of Bird Jaguar, the holy ruler of Yaxchilan. There's more of the monument and more of the text, but what we find out, there's actually a neighboring site just a few miles down the river, and this guy is the ruler of that neighboring site. On the other half of the scene, Bird Jaguar's chief war captain is taking captive the chief war captain of this particular king. And I should know this, I just taught it last week, but in Alma, it talks about how they left none of the prisoners alive except for the chief captains. And that really resonated with me because that's the only ones that the Maya would leave alive because they'd want to boast of it, the fact that they had captured a high-profile enemy. But let's look at some of the details here. In Alma 43:18, we don't need to look all of these up. It just talks about scimitars. Scimitar, by definition, is just a curved weapon. We tend to think of kind of perhaps the Middle Eastern type. But what we see here, he's holding a long, curved weapon. What it's made out of, it's hard to tell. Probably flint or stone. Sorry. But so just want to give you an idea. They had scimitars. In 43:19, this one I think is worth reading. This is an image of Nezahualcóyotl. He was the ruler of Texcoco in the mid-1400s. He's got a helmet on. He's got some thick clothing on. He's got well, this is a back plate, but he'd have one mirrored on his front, so a chest plate as well. He's got jade on his arm. He's got a nice big shield here. His sword, which is kind of like a cricket club with obsidian or flint wedged in the edges of it. But just go ahead and look at this image as I read 43:19. When the armies of the Lamanites saw that the people of Nephi, or that Moroni, had prepared his people with breastplates and with arm shields and also with shields to defend their heads, and they were also dressed with thick clothing, exactly as we see here. Now, in the next verse, we read that, excuse me, the army of Zarahemna was not prepared with any such thing. They had only their swords and their scimitars and their bows and their arrows and their stones and their slings, and they were naked, save it were skin which was girded about their loins. Yea, all were naked, save it were the Zoramites and the Amalekites. This is kind of a recurring theme in the Book of Mormon. The winners have the good armor, as well as the protection of the Lord, and the losers are just wearing their loincloths. We see the same narrative in Mesoamerica as well. The guys that are winning have the helmets, the jade pectorals or chest shields. They've got arm shields made out of jade. They're wearing garments of thick skin. He's got on his wrist here a shield that attaches to the wrist. You guys know what that's called? It's a buckler. I always thought bucklers were what the Texans wore, right? The big belt buckles. But it turns out it's actually a shield that attaches to your wrist, and that frees up your hands so you can have weapons in both hands. But the narrative is the winners have on the armor. The losers are just wearing the loincloth. We see that same narrative here with bird jaguars captive. And these are from different sites, I should mention. And then 3:26 just talks about the bucklers. Okay. In Alma 17, you all know the story. This is Ammon when he goes to the land of Ishmael. He wants to go preach to the king of the Lamanites in the land of Ishmael. He's taken captive and brought before the king. What we're looking at here, this is one of those vases I showed you. So this has been rolled out to a nice flat scene. And we read this. Ammon entered the land of Ishmael. The Lamanites took him and bound him, as was their custom, to bind all Nephites who fell into their hands and carry them before the king. Just like these individuals. They have had their hands tied behind their back. They've been carried before the king who is sitting upon his throne here. And thus it was left to the pleasure of the king to slay them, like this poor guy who's had his head cut off. You see the blood dripping down. Or to retain them in captivity, or to cast them into prison, or to cast them out of the land according to his will and pleasure. Ammon, of course, made friends with the king, and the king offered him his daughter. Now that's a really grand offer until you take into account that Ammon is Prince Ammon. His father is King Mosiah. And what Lamoni is trying to do is form a political alliance. And we see this over and over in Mesoamerica, where kings of one polity are trying to marry their son or daughter to the king of another polity. And so Prince Ammon is being offered Princess Lamoni's daughter. But Ammon says, no, I just want to be your servant. So he sends him out to tend to the flocks. It never says flocks of sheep, by the way. We always, in the pictures, we always assume sheep, but it just says the king's flocks. Other than sheep, what kind of flocks are there? Well, it sounds weird, but there are flocks of turkeys and flocks of peacocks, perhaps. And we know that turkeys and peacocks were actually domesticated in the New World. Kind of changes the visual a little bit when you think of perhaps other types of animals. But there actually is no evidence for domesticated sheep, but there are evidence for domesticated birds. And so he goes out and protects the king's flocks. In the process, cuts off the arms of some of his enemies. And this is something that we see in Mesoamerica. They would sometimes keep these arms as trophies and put them above the fireplace to boast about the fact that they had defeated someone in battle. This poor guy has a little bit of Laban going on too. His head's up here on the hill. But just so you know, this is a cultural practice as well. In 49 verse 22, it talks about their weaponry a bit. Now, in some instances in the Book of Mormon, it says they shoot their arrows, but in this instance, it says they cast their stones and their arrows. Casting is a different motion than shooting. So I think when they talk about shooting bows and arrows, or shooting an arrow, they're talking about bows and arrows. But when it says they cast their arrows, I think they're talking about this weapon here, which is known as an atlatl. What it is, it's a piece of wood basically with a notch on it, and then you attach these large darts to it, and then you basically cast them. You don't let go of the atlatl, but what it does is it causes the arrow to flex and to go a whole lot farther. I've got one of these. I was going to bring it, but I didn't think church security would let me get into the building here. But if you just throw one of these darts, it'll go 25, 30 feet. You put it on atlatl, it'll go 200 yards. World record is 900 feet for one of these things. These were serious weapons. And so just when it says casting darts, I think that's what it's talking about. In Alma 49:6, it just said they had garments of thick skins. We see that over and over. This guy's wearing a full jaguar skin. That was perhaps the thickest skin available to them. In Alma 34:10, Amulek is preaching to the poor Zoramites in Antionum. And just like we heard counsel this last weekend of, especially in priesthood session, things that we are doing that we shouldn't be doing, that's what prophets have always done. They've addressed the issues of the time, they focus on the sins that are being committed, and they say, don't do these things. And it's interesting that Amulek says in Alma 34:10, it is expedient that there should be a great and a last sacrifice, not the sacrifice of man, neither of beast, neither of any manner of fowl. For it shall not be a human sacrifice, but it must be an infinite and eternal sacrifice. So in other words, he's saying, don't sacrifice humans, don't sacrifice beasts, and don't sacrifice fowls. And this is another one of these vases, and this poor fellow has just had his heart ripped out. He's a human sacrificial victim. Next in line to be sacrificed is this jaguar, who looks very concerned, if you ask me. And then we have this beautiful scarlet macaw, human, beast, and fowl. The very three things that Amulek is saying don't sacrifice are the three things that we know that Mesoamericans are sacrificing. And I think there's something to that. And then Mormon 4:14 just talks about the sacrifice of women and children, which is attested to as well. Especially in times of drought, they believe the tears of women and children were more pure, and through sympathetic magic, their tears would bring rains in time of drought. Alma 53:4 talks about the fortifications that were built, the kind of a packed earth with timbers going into it. We see that exact type of fortification in Mesoamerica. This is two images of the same site. This is the site of Dos Pilas in the Patech-Petun region of Guatemala. This is when everything's going good. You see people hanging out in the market, having fun. This is when times are bad. They've built a wall, and you can tell they put it up in a hurry because it's going right through, right over buildings. They've got it too deep, and they're all gathered together in one spot for protection. And archaeologically, these walls match exactly the description of Alma 53:4. They're a packed earth with pickets in them. Now, the pickets have long since disintegrated, 1,500 years ago. But we can do what's called phytolithic analysis of the soil, and we can actually determine what type of tree these pickets were from. In Mormon 1:7, it says, the entire face of the earth had become covered with buildings. This is the site of El Mirador in northern Guatemala. We've excavated just a fraction of the site. We've been digging there for 40 years, and we've got less than 0.5% of it excavated. You still have to either helicopter in there or take a hike by burro for 3 days to get there. But thousands and thousands of buildings, just 3,000 buildings just in the site core. This site was the size of Manhattan, and this dates smack dab to Book of Mormon times. Right around the time of Christ, this city was flourishing. And so I just wanted to give you an idea of what buildings covering the face of the earth would look like. This is that same site we just looked at from satellite view. We've tweaked the colors a little bit to make some of the details pop. But these spokes that are coming out are actually roads that lead from El Mirador to sites, other sites in that region. Some of these roads were 20, 30, 40 miles long. We know of hundreds of miles of these roads. This is what they look like. They were elevated about a meter tall. They're about 6 feet wide, give or take. They did that so in the rainy season, they had a nice dry place to walk. They would cover these things with a limestone plaster, and there were these gleaming, beautiful white roads. And so they were called Sac Bay. Sac means white, Bay means road. But in, 3 Nephi 6:8, it says roads were cast up. And I think this is what they're talking about, these elevated 3-foot-high roads. These are literally cast up. Helaman 3:7 talks about these cities of cement. This is the site of Teotihuacan, cities of cement in the north, more specifically. Teotihuacan is north of the main Maya area, and it was 8 square miles of concrete. If you wanted to plant something, you had to put it in a pot. They had the concrete that they used is actually, some of it is in better condition than the concrete in front of my house in Provo. I mean, this stuff was very, very durable, and just the extent of their usage is phenomenal. And I know I'm going kind of quick here, but just because of time. This Mayan glyph means, it's read phonetically, ha. It's a logosyllabic system, which means, it's like, have you ever written I love you, but you draw an I and then a heart and then a little sheep? It's kind of that type of concept. So the word ha means water, or when it's appended to the end of a word, it means near the water. So we have a lot of Mayan sites like Yash Ha, Pusil Ha, Lakam Ha, that are cities that are right either on a lake or by a river. Now we have the city of Nephi, which is up in the highlands, but we also have the city of Nephi Ha, which is located on the east borders near the seashore, so kind of like Nephi by the sea or something like that. And so anytime you see Ha at the end of a Nephite city name, it's probably by a lake or a river or the sea. Temples and altars, we get discussion of that throughout the Book of Mormon. This is the site of Tikal. We have many, many altars in conjunction with the temple, and the sacrifices they would do were animal sacrifices, which was required by the law of Moses and which we would expect to see with Nephite temple worship. They tell us specifically they're obedient to the law of Moses, and they continue to do animal sacrifice up to the time of Christ. We haven't known a whole lot about Mayan temple worship, but about 10 years ago, these murals were discovered in the site of San Bartolo in northern Guatemala. They were discovered in a small room at the base of the temple. The doors are only about this tall, so you kind of have to duck to get in there. And once you get in, at about eye level, you have these beautiful, colorful murals. I only have one that kind of shows some of the colors here, but all of these have preserved their colors as well. There are very few hieroglyphs on it, but the pictures seem to tell a story. Just like we use church art to tell stories to children, for example. They were used for what they call didactic purposes. Mayan scholars still are puzzling over the meaning a little bit, but here's the basics of what they figured out. And I think to Latter-day Saints, this probably resonates a little bit more than it does to non-members who know nothing about temple worship. It starts with the scene of creation. This is the paradise of creation. It's likened unto the Garden of Eden. It's a place of beauty, flowers, trees, animals. You see, birds flying around. And from this garden of origin, the people are sent forth, and they're taught how to do proper sacrifice, animal sacrifice, burnt offerings. From there, we move on to a scene of resurrection. This is their god of corn, their maize god, and he is their god of death and resurrection. He's resurrecting out of the earth here. This round thing represents actually a turtle shell, and he's resurrecting out of the turtle shell. And then ultimately, the maize god is enthroned on a heavenly throne, and that's actually facing this scene. And then what we have at the final end of this whole scene is a human ruler being enthroned in exactly the same manner as the god of death and resurrection. Now, if you think about our own temple worship, without divulging anything, if you look at the sequence here, it really ought to resonate a little bit. And I think perhaps as Latter-day Saints, we can have insight into these scenes that perhaps mainstream Mesoamericanists can't. Here's a close-up of the ruler being enthroned on a wooden scaffold. In Mosiah 2:7, we read that Benjamin caused a tower to be erected so that his son Mosiah could be enthroned. That whole meeting from the famous speech, of Benjamin at the temple was actually an enthronement ceremony where he's passing the rulership to his son Mosiah. Odds are they already had the materials in place to build this throne. What we see in Mesoamerica, and this, by the way, dates to the 1st century BC, right around 100 BC, actually. King Mosiah II was throned around 124 BC. So this is smack dab time frame of Benjamin. So we see him being seated on a wooden tower, receiving the regalia of rulership, just as King Mosiah II was given the Liahona, sort of Laban, the records, and all of the Nephite sacred paraphernalia, so to speak. So this is probably a more accurate view of what these look like. And because they would use these scaffolds for enthronements, the odds are Benjamin already had the pieces, and they just had to throw it together really quick for this enthronement ceremony. In Mosiah 11, we read about royal palaces, most famously that of wicked King Noah, his elaborate palace. It says he had fine work of wood. When I thought of fine woodwork, I used to always think of, the chair my grandpa made for my grandma, and he carved a little flower in it. I'm like, wow, that's really fine woodwork. This is actually from the site of Tikal. Let me show you a drawing of this. This whole panel is only about this big. Each of these individual glyphs is just a tiny little thing, but they're intricately carved. It almost looks like calligraphy. I know it probably just looks like spaghetti to you. Let me point out what's going on here. You've got a king seated on his throne. Here's his face. That's his eye, his nose, his mouth, his chin. His right arm, here are his fingers, is holding a big spear. His left arm has a buckler attached to his wrist, and here are his fingers. Here's his right leg and his toes, and then his left knee, and then his toes here. And then this is the throne he's sitting on. There's a big snake that surrounds him. There's a little birdie up here. You see the beak and the eyes, the wings coming off here. And then, of course, these hieroglyphs here. There is chumlach, which means to be seated. It's a general verb meaning accession or signifies rulership, and they're seated upon their tzam, which is a throne. Every time the word sit or seated is used in the Book of Mormon, it's in reference to a throne, either an earthly throne or a heavenly throne. I did a study of this a few years ago. And likewise, this is how the verb is used in the Maya hieroglyphs. These lakamtun, these monuments that you see all over the landscape, they've got glyphs adorning the sides. The ruler's on the front here. It's hard to make out. Those are his eyes, his nose, his mouth. He's got a little beard here. The word for these monuments, the native word is lakamtun, which literally means large stone. And the in Omni 120, it stands out to me because it says they brought a large stone with engravings on it. And Mosiah was able to translate that. And I think they're using this, it's a proper noun, a lakamtun, a large stone. Large stones aren't just big rocks. For them, a lakamtun specifically is a carved monument, just like the one that was brought to Mosiah. In Mosiah 12:5, it says they had heavy burdens lashed upon their backs, both the people of Alma and the people of Limhi. Limhi because of their wickedness, Alma because of their righteousness. For Alma, their burdens were made light. The way they would attach these burdens was with what's called a tump line. I've seen in Mesoamerica, even today, little Maya men carrying refrigerators on their back. I mean, they can carry enormous loads with these tump lines. But the beautiful promise to me, to the people of Alma, is the Lord says, I'll make your burdens light. And then he says, lift up your heads and rejoice. And I think what he says is, even though you've got these heavy burdens, you can literally that's how light the burdens were, is they could actually lift up their heads and not feel the burdens upon their back. And to me, it's a beautiful promise that he gives to the people of Alma. And this Mesoamerican insight, to me, adds depth of meaning to the promise. This is one of the more famous hieroglyphs, among Mormons anyway, is the Iut glyph. It means that then it came to pass. They also have the glyph Uti, which means since it came to pass, and Utom, it shall come to pass. The Maya didn't have punctuation. Every time they wanted to start a new phrase or a clause, they had to start it with one of these. And that probably explains why it came to pass appears 1,500 times in the Book of Mormon. Mark Twain said if you took them all out, you'd be left with a pamphlet. He was no fan of the Book of Mormon, but he didn't understand the beauty of it. The Maya are famous for their calendrics. Last year, people thought it was going to end because they misunderstood the Maya calendar. On December 12th, the date was 130000. And they got really excited about zeros just like we do. The year 2000, we had a big party because there's lots of zeros. For the Maya, it was the same thing, but it wasn't the end of anything. And so the world did not end exactly as they never said it would. Okay. Now, I mentioned before, each of these monuments, those big stone monuments I showed you, they always begin with a count of 400 years and a count of 20 years, and then a count of years and a count of 20 days and a count of single days. The word for the 20-year period is katun, or katun. And the year for the 400-year period, the word for the 400 period is baktun. We count by tens. We have a decimal system because we have 10 fingers. They count by 20s because they counted their toes. That really is the reason. And so for us, 10 times 10 is a decade times a decade is exciting because that gives you a century. For them, a katun times a katun equals baktun. Now, the reason I mention this is the 400-year period, which was their main time period. Again, they start every monument with this, counting back to their zero date of 3114 BC. In Alma 4510, for example, we won't go through all of these, but 4510, he says, Behold, I perceive that this very people, the Nephites, according to the spirit of revelation which is in me, in 400 years from the time that Jesus Christ shall manifest himself unto them, shall dwindle in unbelief. So they're emphasizing this 400-year period. They do it again in Helaman, this is Samuel the Lamanite. He emphasizes it twice. In Mormon 8:6, he says 400 years have passed away. And then, for me, the clincher is this one, Moroni 10:1. I would that they should know that more than 420 years have passed away since the sign was given of the coming of Christ. Just like every Maya monument begins with a count of 400 years and a count of 20 years, Moroni in his final sealing chapter begins with a count of 400 years and a count of 20 years in perfect Mesoamerican fashion. Many of you are familiar with chiasmus, the work of John Welch at BYU. Alma 36 being the most famous example. For those who aren't familiar, it's just an ancient literary pattern where it's kind of chiasmus is based after the Greek letter chi, which is like the letter X. It's basically a reverse parallelism. It's like I am Sam, Sam I am. That's a chiasm, where it's basically the same words or thoughts repeated in reverse order from the beginning. In the Book of Mormon, we see a lot of parallelism. We actually begin with a parallel quatrain here, a parallel for the city of Laman and the city of Josh and the city of Gad and the city of Kishkumen. Have I caused to be burned with fire and the inhabitants thereof. And this is mirrored here. I did send down fire to destroy them because of their wickedness in casting out the prophets. That's mirrored down here because they did cast them all out. Why? To declare unto them concerning their wickedness and their abominations. And so that's sort of the pivot point in the chiasm. As a chiasm, this particular one isn't all that spectacular. But why it jumps out to me is, if you'll recall that city I showed you that had the big wall built around it very quickly, I found this text from that site. There's a war against some city. It's eroded. We can't read it. Then it says it got burned, dos pilas. It got burned, question mark, probably dos pilas, but it's eroded, war against. So it's a chiasmus talking about the destruction of cities being burned by fire. So not only is it the same subject matter, but it's also written in the same poetic fashion. And for me, that's a fascinating parallel. I mentioned before the maize god, the corn god is their primary god of death and resurrection. We see him, that's one of the sort of the unifying things of Mesoamerican cultures, is the worship of this dying and resurrecting god. What stands out to me is the way he presents himself to the Nephites, the way the Savior presents himself to the Nephites, compared to the way he presents himself to those in the Old World. When he appears to his apostles after his resurrection in Jerusalem, he says, "Behold my hands and my feet, that it is I myself. Handle me and see, for a spirit hath not flesh and bones." He says, I need you to touch my hands and my feet so you know that I have been killed on your behalf. Why his hands and his feet? Because the sign of human sacrifice in the old world was crucifixion in the hands and the feet. When he comes to the Nephites, the first thing he says is, "Arise and come forth unto me, that you may thrust your hands into my side." That's the first thing he tells them to do. And thrust is a forceful motion, by the way. And also that you may feel the prints of the nails in my hands and in my feet, that ye may know that I am the God of Israel. Why is he having the Nephites touch him in his side first? Well, as you'll recall, that poor guy being laid across the altar had his heart ripped out. And the way they would do that is they would make an incision beneath the rib cage, well, on this side, then they would reach up and pull out the still beating heart, right? It's like Indiana Jones, Kalima, if you guys maybe haven't seen it, I don't know. But the point is, if he's trying to convince the people, I have been sacrificed on your behalf. For the Nephites, this is how you communicate that to them. They've never seen a crucifixion. They don't really seem to have a clear understanding of what crucifixion really is, but they understand human sacrifice, and for them, human sacrifice is having the heart ripped out through an incision in the side. In Alma 5, we read this masterful discourse that Alma gives to the people of Zarahemla. Before I actually talk about that, what we're looking at here is a scene of deity impersonation or God impersonation. The ruler would wear a mask. It's hard to tell. This is his face here. You see his eye, his nose, and his mouth. But in front of him, he's got a mask. You see the kind of the lips and the chin here. This guy's wearing a big jaguar mask. It's kind of X-ray vision. We're to understand that it's a full jaguar mask, but they want to let us know who's inside, so they give us a cutaway view. This guy's got a mask on. This guy's got a big bird mask on. You see the eye and kind of the feathers and things going on here. The reason they would do this, they would put on these masks in these ritual moments, and they believed that they would literally transform into these gods. They would become these gods. They weren't just play acting. They would transform into them. And just like Amulek was preaching to the people of Antionum, the Zoramites, not to do things, I think that's what Alma is doing to the people of Zarahemla in Alma 5. He condemns them for their idolatry. In fact, later when he's in Gideon, he says, I hope you're not worshiping idols like they're doing over in Zarahemla. But when we get to Alma 5 and he says, have you received his image in your countenances? I think what he's saying is, we've got this glyphic phrase, which is ubahil, which whenever we see these deity impersonation rituals, they always use this verb. And what it literally means is, the ruler receives the image of God in his countenance. That is the non-LDS interpretation of that, by the way. And when I read that for the first time, this is a fairly new glyphic interpretation just in the last few years. And I mean, the wording instantly jumped out to me, and I thought to myself, I think what Alma is saying is, rather than impersonating all these other gods, right, what manner of men ought you to be, even as Christ is? If you're going to imitate a god, it needs to be the God of Israel. And they need to stop chasing after these false gods, impersonating these false gods through these rituals. And again, that kind of changes our interpretation of that verse, but I think it actually adds a depth of meaning that was lost otherwise. Now, all of this stuff I think is really interesting. It's fascinating, but when it comes down to it, what's the only proof that the Book of Mormon is true? It's, of course, Moroni 10, 4 and 5. I got my testimony of the Book of Mormon long before I ever studied any archaeology. People sometimes ask me, what is the biggest piece of proof? And I always turn to this. I'm not out to prove the Book of Mormon true, but I am out to prove it interesting. And I think the stuff that I've showed you today is really interesting stuff. But I know you've read it a million times, but I think it bears repeating. When you shall receive these things, I would exhort you that you would ask God, the eternal Father, in the name of Christ, if these things are not true. And if you shall ask with a sincere heart, with real intent, having faith in Christ, he will manifest the truth of it unto you by the power of the Holy Ghost. And by the power of the Holy Ghost, you may know the truth of all things. I want to add my witness to that of Moroni. I know the Book of Mormon is true, not through archaeology, but through the spiritual witness. I'm so grateful for this book. I hope you guys have gotten something out of this, gotten excited about the Book of Mormon. I hope you fall in love with it the way I've fallen in love with it if you haven't already. I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but I just love this book. And I just want to testify of that in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.